I did not run for office to be helping out a bunch of fat cat bankers on Wall Street. The only ones that are going to be paying out these fat bonuses are the ones that have now paid back that TARP money. And
you think that's why they paid it back so quickly?
I think in some cases that was a motivation, which I think tells me that the people on Wall Street still don't get it. They don't get it. They're still puzzled. Why is it that people are mad at the banks? Well, let's see. You guys are drawing down $10-20 million bonuses after America went through the worst economic year that it's gone through in decades, and you guys caused the problem, and we got 10% unemployment. Why do you think people might be a little frustrated?
One of my favorite series of videos on the internet is that of the Jon Stewart-Bill O'Reilly debates from back in the day. In 2025, an age of internet spectacles and chaos, the videos have an oddly serene feeling to them. Most of them have no loud intros, no music, minimal graphics, just Jon Stewart, Bill O'Reilly, and the liminal set of the Bill O'Reilly Show. 4 out of the 5 interviews were recorded in the midst of the Obama administration, with 3 of them taking place within the first 2 years of Obama taking office. They offer a glimpse into what it was like to be in the political mainstream during the Obama years, and what it was like to realize that the president's campaign of hope wouldn't be enough to usher in the change that the country so desperately needed. Every interview that takes place during the Obama administration has at least one segment dedicated to discussing the president's performance thus far. And in each one, you get to witness Stewart's increasing sense of disillusionment, and more than that, the feeling of dissonance that came with trying to maintain good politics while still existing within the political mainstream. Within a single interview, he would often go from expressing dissatisfaction with Obama.
I have been saddened to see that someone who ran on the idea that you can't expect to get different results with the same people and the same system has kept in place so much of the same system.
But he still has been
to defending him as simply a man who is trying his best.
He ran on the idea that the middle class was going to be his focus.
And it isn't.
Well, he's trying right now to preserve the tax cuts for them.
I feel for Stewart. In the midst of the 2008 financial collapse, Obama's campaign and its success served as a testament to the viability of progressive politics in the country. When progressive ideas are well articulated, unflinching, and wrapped up in a charismatic package, they have the power to win elections. The heartbreaking truth is that Obama, once in office, betrayed these ideals with his own tepidness and hypocrisy.
You voted for him. Has he lived up to your expectations?
No.
Yes.
But I don't know if my expectations were fair to that individual.
I'm not here today to talk about why I think Obama betrayed his own campaign vision once he took office. I could do that, but instead, I'll just say this. In a 2009 60 Minutes interview clip that has more or less been scrubbed off the internet, Obama showed a rare sign of frustration with the bankers that contributed to the financial collapse in the first place. It's the clip that I played at the beginning of this video. In it, he bemoaned the fat cat bankers that paid out big bonuses to themselves while the rest of the country was spiraling towards irreparable financial collapse. It's an agreeable sentiment, but it's not one that he stuck to, as the interviewer Steve Croft even pointed out himself during the interview.
Do you think that they made some of these bonuses based in part on the generosity and policies of the United States government to help put the financial system back on its feet?
I think there is no doubt about it.
The day after this clip aired, Obama held a meeting with some of the top banking executives in the country to discuss financial regulation, and almost a decade later, after leaving office, he would even accept large speaking gigs at corporate banking firms. As you can probably tell, today I want to talk about banking, but I'm not going to talk about 2008 or the recession. Instead, I want to talk about money laundering. Yeah, this is a follow-up to my last video, where I talked about the lazy and uncritical ways in which the media often discusses the war on drugs. Today, in the midst of increasing global tensions and with a presidential administration that has increasingly postured and militarized against drug-dealing boogeymen in both Mexico and the rest of Latin America, I think it's important to step back and reevaluate who is complicit in conversations about drug trafficking. And there's no better place to start this conversation than by looking at the massive global institutions that finance and facilitate literally every transaction in our modern world. A look at the banking industry and its complicity in laundering money for criminals implicates not only bankers and compliance experts, but also regulators and government officials, maybe even as high up as Obama himself. In evaluating the crimes of the banking industry, it might encourage us to reevaluate who we choose to designate as drug dealers or terrorists or good or bad people. So let's just get started. The year is 2007. In California, an 18-year-old Brandon McCartney, better known by the name Little B, just released his first album as a member of the rap group The Pack. In DC, Nancy Pelosi just became the first female Speaker of the House. And in Mexico City, the offices of the currency exchange house known as Casa de Cambio Puebla were raided by Mexican authorities. Casa de Cambio Puebla had been on the Mexican government's radar for a while. When they stormed the firm's Mexico City International Airport office, they arrested the branch's manager, Pedro Alfonso Alatorre Dami. In raids at other offices belonging to CDC Puebla, they arrested compliance officer Amador Cordero Vasquez, along with 2 others. Alatorre Dami was perhaps the most sought-after member of the operation. In Mexican press reports that would follow the raid, the 36-year-old was labeled as the financial operator for the Sinaloa cartel, headed, at the time, of course, by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. And as the word made its way to America and time went by, Alatorre Dami would be remembered in the press as, apparently, one of the most prominent figures in the whole business. According to some reports at the time of the raid, CDC Puebla and its operators engaged in illicit activity by accepting massive quantities of dirty money from drug dealers before wiring these funds to American bank accounts. At that point, the money would get spent on whatever the cartel needed to keep its operations going. At the time of the investigations that led to CDC Puebla's downfall, many of the major transactions manifested in the form of airplane purchases. To see where these airplanes went, though, we need to take a step back. The raids on Casa de Cambio Puebla took place in November 2007, but a month and a half prior to those raids, and about 600 miles away, a Gulfstream II jet crash-landed near the city of Mérida in the Yucatan Peninsula. The plane had taken off from Colombia, and after being denied landing at 2 separate Mexican airports for suspicious activities, the craft was forced to fly circles in the air before running out of fuel and crash landing into the wilderness. When Mexican authorities got to the plane, they found 3.7 tons of cocaine on board. Within the next week, both the alleged pilot and co-pilot would be apprehended. The news of the drug bust made rounds among both reporters in Mexico and the United States. And most relevant to our story, it was discovered that the plane had been purchased through an elaborate criminal network that included Casa de Cambio Puebla. Suddenly, government authorities in the United States had strong evidence of money laundering, and it came in handy given the fact that 2 years prior to the crash, multiple federal agencies had opened investigations into those same suspicious wire transfers that were coming out of CDC Puebla and others. Number 1 on the Fed's list of banks that were complicit in these transfers was Wachovia.
As a young person thinking about where to begin my career, I would be focused on where can I put a stake in the ground and really make a difference and have the broadest range of experiences in as short a period of time as possible.
Although that name might not ring too much of a bell these days, it got bought out by Wells Fargo in 2009 in the midst of the financial collapse. In 2007, it was among the most important banks in the country, being the 4th largest in the United States based on assets. When the Fed started looking into Wachovia's activities in 2005, they did so because of the copious amounts of money being transferred through the bank and its correspondence by currency exchange houses in Mexico. When it was all said and done, investigators found that between May 1st, 2004 and May 31st, 2007, Wachovia had processed over 2.1 million wire payments totaling over $370 billion. Almost all of those transactions went unmonitored by the bank, and because of that, at least $110 million ended up being dirty money. And that amount only represented the small fraction of transactions that they could prove were dirty. Millions more likely went unaccounted for. And that Gulfstream II jet wasn't the only one that Wachovia helped these exchange houses pay for. A year prior, in 2006, a DC-9 jet landed in an airport in Playa del Carmen, Mexico, with over 5.5 tons of cocaine on board. The aircraft, apprehended by Mexican soldiers upon landing, was financed through the same network of currency exchange houses as the Gulfstream, and as a consequence, relied on money laundered by Wachovia and other banks. The federal investigation made shockwaves in the American financial community. When the investigation closed and it came time for consequences, the bank was forced to pay up a combined total of $160 million to the government. Especially at the time, the fine was considered to be quite a hefty punishment. The fact that Wachovia was one of the largest banks while it was laundering all this money only added fuel to the media fire. Although the fine was certainly large, it came alongside a much more controversial legal decision. The federal government, in finalizing its case in 2010, decided that instead of directly prosecuting anybody at Wachovia, which at this point had already become Wells Fargo, for their complicity in drug trafficking, or instead of just prosecuting the bank as a whole, they would offer the bank and its officials a deferred prosecution agreement. Per the terms of the agreement, the government would give the bank a year to improve its adherence to regulations, and at the end of that year, if they didn't have any more problems, the government would choose to not prosecute any further. This move, of course, being celebrated by the bank and its supporters in the government, was seen as preposterous by many. How is it possible that no banker or individual got in trouble at a bank that quite literally allowed for millions of dollars in dirty money to pass through its system? That dirty money, once trafficked, went straight to funding more illicit operations, which not only allowed for the worsening of the violent drug war that had kicked off in the mid-2000s, but also brought thousands of kilos worth of cocaine into the United States, perpetuating an even deeper substance abuse struggle within our own borders. To many, Wachovia was no better than the drug dealers themselves for what they allowed to happen. But in spite of all this, no single individual actually got in trouble. I'd like to return to this point and further interrogate the complicity of those that allowed such infractions to slide, but before that, I want to point out someone at Wachovia who tried to speak up, but couldn't.
And that plane had been bought with laundered funds that they were transferred through Wachovia and Bank of America. We are rejoined now by Martin Woods, formerly at Wachovia. He served as director of Wachovia's anti-money laundering unit in London, and he left the bank after he was displeased with how executives responded to his talking about what was going on.
Martin Woods was born in Liverpool around the time that the Beatles, his fellow Liverpool natives, were reshaping the music industry in their image. Woods' claim to fame would come decades later, though, starting with his arrival at Wachovia in 2005 as a senior anti-money laundering officer. Before Wachovia, he got his start with the London Metropolitan Police's drug squad, before later rising to become a global expert on anti-money laundering banking compliance. By the time he got to Wachovia, he was no rookie when it came to dirty money, and that's what made his findings even more shocking. In the depths of Wachovia systems, Woods found multiple series of sequentially numbered traveler's checks. The checks often lacked dates, identification features, and the signatures were often entirely forged or, as he put it, signed by Mickey Mouse. In response to these discoveries, he started submitting more and more suspicious activity reports in order to alert people at the bank and prevent what was happening. Instead of hearing back, though, he would often find himself stonewalled or even in trouble. As time went on and Woods kept finding more red flags, he found himself getting pushed further and further out of the bank. Even as the news of the federal investigation made light and the bank started to shutter its services to casas de cambio in Mexico, Woods still felt ostracized at his own job. Here's what he had to say to me about the experience in a recent interview.
I'm confronting the head of correspondent banking, the head of South America, the head of Mexico, the head of compliance for the investment bank, because he as he said to me, he said, I'm having my ear chewed off because of you. And I said, I'm doing my job. So I was in confrontation. And what I really discovered, what triggered it for me, was these sequentially numbered traveler's checks.
In one encounter, Woods told me about his boss calling to inform him that his bonus for the year was $0. Woods, with his background in policing and concern for ethics above money, saw no problem with this. But his boss clearly thought it would mean a lot. Here's what Woods himself had to say about it.
My boss called me to say to me, your bonus for last year was $0. I said, that's what you called me for? Okay. I mean, did I expect anything else? And when the whole case blew up in the press, I wrote to him. I said, I'd just like to correct you. You did mistakenly say my bonus for the previous year was $0. Actually, my bonus was I hung on to my integrity and my credibility, whilst many people at Wachovia Bank lost theirs. And once it's gone, you never get it back. And he was raging mad. I thought, yeah, but that's what it is. You sold yours. He did, because this is a guy who went to church every Sunday. And then Monday to Saturday, he worshipped at the altar of the dollar. Everything was a dollar. I assure you, when he told me my bonus was $0, he was aroused in more way than one of that. That was a euphoric moment for him, right? To me, I was going, really? Wow.
Woods told me a lot about how the bonus system specifically often gave compliancers an incentive to let suspicious activity continue. The bonuses, which are still commonplace today for many compliance officers, are attached to the wider bonus structure at the bank, meaning that the officers get more money when they help the bank make more money, not when they help it comply with government regulations. To Woods, understandably, this system compromises officers and muddles their desire to do right with financial incentives.
I've actually run this before, and I've said to many compliance professionals, would you take a higher salary and no bonus? And many would, because the bonus is used to compromise them, and their job would be far easier because nothing would depend, their actions would not in any way impact their remuneration. Their bonus depends upon giving certain people what they want, and what they want is a green light to go and make money, and that might mean ignoring a regulation, cutting a corner, or you getting out of the way.
Perhaps worse than anything else, though, was the way that Wachovia designed its banking systems in order to make the entire money laundering process easier. This goes well beyond just a bonus structure for officers. As he explained to me, Woods' American colleagues set a rule stating that clients could not deposit batches of cash greater than $20,000. This, as Woods put it, gave the Casas de Cambio a method for laundering the money. Whenever a batch came in that was more than $20,000, they just take some of the travelers' checks out and move them elsewhere, eliminating any proof that they were breaking the bank's rules. Another time, Woods told me that he found a batch that breached the $20,000 rule, and he reported it to his higher-ups, but they came back and told him that the rules weren't broken because the rules only applied to batches that came in American dollars. Because the batch in question came in the form of some other currency, Woods was forced to let it through. And this is where we get to what might be the most astounding interaction that he told me about. At some point during his time in Wachovia, Woods was paid a visit by the bank's head of correspondent banking for South America. At the meeting, Woods' colleague lamented the fact that, in spite of Wachovia's ability to process and clear dollar transactions for cheaper than almost any other bank, they were still getting outcompeted by other global banks for their inability to process other currencies as efficiently. Of course, this delay in processing was because Woods, as the senior anti-money laundering official in London, was not allowing many non-dollar transactions to go through because of how suspicious they appeared to him. In the meeting between the two men, Woods' colleague asked him to clear the non-dollar cash. Here's what Woods told me about that encounter.
The head of correspondent banking in South America was frustrated at my actions, and he was a bully. So he flew to London and brought his charm bag with him, right? And he took me for a fine lunch and told me he needed my help because he had a problem. I said, "What's your problem?" He said, "I can clear dollars cheaper than my competitors who are not American banks." And he said to his customers, "Why am I losing business? And why are you not putting these dollars through me?" I said, "Well, we know you can do the dollars cheaper." And they turn around and said, "But what are you going to do about this?" And they turn around and they point to piles of sterling, euros, Swiss francs, and other currencies. He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, others can do everything for me. You don't do this. I need to actually clear this cash." And he said to me, so Martin, what I need from you is I need you to clear that cash in London, because all non-dollar cash came through London. All non-dollar transactions came through London. And I said, that cash will not be cleared in London. He said, "Martin, I'm so much more senior than you. I'm telling you to do it." I said, "You can't tell me to break the law." He said, "I'm not telling you to break the law." I said, "You are, because that's not going to happen. I suspect that's a proceed of drug trafficking." He said, you can't say it is." "I don't need to say it is. I just need to suspect it is. I can't unsee what I see." I said, "Also, the head of London won't allow you to do it." He said, "Well, how do you know?" I said, "Because I'll advise him and he'll take my advice and he won't allow you to do it."
This confrontation is so telling, not only because it shows how desperate people at the bank were to allow laundered money through the system, but also because it highlights something I haven't talked about yet. The fact that Wachovia was not the only bank laundering money at the time, and that their knowledge of this fact only fueled them to launder even more money. Let's talk about one of the other banks involved.
If you're going to do business internationally, you should be with a bank that knows about international business. HSBC Commercial Banking spans 64 countries and territories around the globe.
With your machines, I make 10 times more lassi than I used to.
Your business success is out there. Is your bank?
The Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, today known as HSBC, was founded in the 1860s after the British Empire took control of Hong Kong after the First Opium Wars. I'll spare you over a century of history and skip straight to the year 2012, when, in what was an even bigger shock than the Wachovia case, HSBC's American branch was hit with a $1.9 billion fine for its complicity in money laundering. The craziest part of it all? A lot of the laundering that the bank was involved in was via the exact same casas de cambio as Wachovia a few years prior. The case, given the massive fine and correspondingly massive amounts of money that the bank laundered, garnered even more attention than the Wachovia case ever did. And, of course, when the bank was hit with nothing more than a fine and its own deferred prosecution agreement, commentators and regular citizens and foes of the Obama-era Justice Department were understandably up in arms. The man at the center of all these cases was none other than Obama's Attorney General at the time, Eric Holder. Holder has an interesting legacy these days. He resigned in 2015 after facing some of the most intense scrutiny that any Attorney General has ever received from Congress. The reason for his treatment came from his involvement in Operation Fast and Furious, which was an attempted sting operation in which the federal government tried to catch high-level cartel operatives by selling them guns in Arizona. The operation failed, and most of the guns walked, meaning that the buyers got to use the guns without almost any intervention from law enforcement. For years afterwards, guns related to the operation continued to be found in unrelated criminal cases. When Operation Fast and Furious became known to Congress and the public, there was once again an understandable uproar. For his refusal to cooperate with a congressional investigation on the issue, he became the first sitting Attorney General to ever be held in contempt of Congress. And, of course, this is all secondary to the way that he treated banks. It was in large part thanks to Holder's Justice Department that the idea of banks being too big to fail, or in many cases, too big to jail, really became as omnipresent as it did. In a report compiled by the Republican staff for the House of Representatives Financial Committee, Holder's interest in protecting HSBC because of its prominence took center stage. There are two statements from Holder, made 2 months apart, that really highlight the lack of consistency that the Justice Department exercised when trying to explain its actions to the public. In the first, he expresses his fears that the prosecution of big banks would be dangerous for the economy. In his words, quote, "I am concerned that the size of some of these financial institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy." End quote. In this statement, he makes it abundantly clear that his Justice Department really feared the over-prosecution of big banks. In the uneasy aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the vested interest that both the American and British governments had in keeping profitable businesses like HSBC afloat, prosecuting a big bank to Holder's DOJ seemed not only economically risky, but politically risky as well. That's not what he said 2 months later, though. Here's the second statement. Quote, "Now, there are a number of factors that we have to take into consideration as we decide who we're going to prosecute. Innocent people can be impacted by a prosecution brought of a financial institution or any corporation. But let me be very, very, very clear. Banks are not too big to jail. If we find a bank or a financial institution that has done something wrong, if we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, those cases will be brought." End quote. Now, this statement is promising, sure, but it's also an overwhelming lie. HSBC and Wachovia laundered money beyond a reasonable doubt, but when the investigations were all said and done, not a single person went to jail for their involvement in the crimes. And let me make it clear, especially in the HSBC case, that a $1.9 billion fine is nothing to laugh at. Woods told me in our conversation that beyond the fine being massive, HSBC probably also spent another $1 billion trying to improve its compliance systems in the aftermath of this case. Woods also told me, though, that by and large, across the banking industry, not much has improved in terms of anti-money laundering to this day. To Woods, there is only one real solution.
Laws and regulations that are normally typed in black ink on white paper. So yeah, it's black and white. And some, businesses like grey, lawyers like grey because they can hide in grey. But most law is black and white. And I said to the people at ABN AMRO Bank, look, we have to put the right controls in place because it's a crime not to, and somebody could go to prison. And after a while, one of the senior managers said to me, Martin, I wish one of you would effing go to prison. And I was shocked. I looked around and said, I beg your pardon? He said, that's what do you mean? He said, Martin, then people would listen to you. So I think banks and their businesses have an awful lot of influence and power in government policy. Now, if as a consequence of that, governments fail to properly punish and adequately and appropriately punish bank complicity or bankers' complicity, individuals' complicity, right, in this money laundering, then they should not be surprised if it continues.
To some, the direct prosecution of bankers might seem a little crazy. It's not like they're the ones directly selling or moving or producing the drugs. But as Woods put it,
it's a supply chain of drug trafficking all the way to the end user, right? And so there's a whole load of drug traffickers, and some of them, I've got some bad news for you, they're Americans, right? In America, right? Doing this business. And there's a profit to be made from that. There's huge sums of money. Nothing corrupts like money. And so there's bankers who happen to be American, British, German, who see this opportunity to say, how do I get myself some of that money and actually make it appear to be legitimate and help my customers with their, objectives, because to them, they're nice guys.
Since the Mexican drug war officially began in 2006, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, disappeared, and displaced. In the United States, nearly 100,000 people die each year to drug overdoses. We have to remember that most of this money flows through our own banking systems. When whistleblowers like Woods demonstrate how identifiable these illicit funds usually are, we have to begin to question the moral standing of individuals that allow such laundering to occur. In 2009, Obama was mad at the fat cat bankers who paid out big bonuses to themselves while millions of Americans were suffering from economic disaster. Only a few years after taking office, though, his administration let all of these fat cats walk via these deferred prosecution agreements. Facts like this make you wonder what happened and why Obama went from a promising young political outsider to an institutionalized corporate politician. Today, we face the exact same challenges of the past 2 decades. Drug use and related violence continues to surge on both sides of the border, and all the while, our leaders continue to resort to the same failed methods of prevention that their predecessors did. In the United States, Trump has upped the ante, designating foreign drug cartels as terrorists and escalating tensions with any foreign leaders that he deems to be in bed with the cartel. In Mexico, as I touched on in my last video, the rhetoric has shifted in recent years, but militarization continues at historic rates, and states like Sinaloa have consequently seen some of the worst violence in their modern histories. It's a terrible world we live in, where our leaders must pretend to play whack-a-mole with an amorphous foreign enemy, while the observable and known facilitators of all these crimes are sat in some of the fanciest offices within our own borders. In regards to how effective the prosecution of bankers and banks would be as a means of reducing drug crimes, Woods put it best.
In 2016, I presented a corruption summit in the UK, and the president of Kenya said, a plane will not take off if it can't land. And that was in the context of money laundering. You can't launder money if you haven't got an account to pay it into. You have to sometimes ask yourself the question, how close is a launderer's finger to the trigger of the killer's gun? And that's the connection. That's where it is, right? How close is the launderer's finger to the needle going to somebody's arm, to the actual production of the cocaine, to the trafficking? It is all about money. Drug trafficking is a totally fiscal business to make money. So the banks who fail to put in the right level of controls have to be complicit in that.
When considering complicity in crimes that kill thousands and displace thousands more, we must begin to look at everyone who lets it slide, from the drug dealer to the financer to the banker who simply allows the dealer to hold an account, even to the government officials who let these crimes go, and the president that appoints those officials and comes to their defense when they face popular scrutiny. Every single person must be considered complicit to some degree. I'd go as far as to say that the people who sold the airplanes that helped traffic the drugs are, to some extent, complicit. But wait, who exactly were those planes purchased from? And who exactly paid for them? You see, when I was doing my original research for this video, I was having a difficult time understanding exactly how the casas de cambio process worked to get the dirty money from the drug dealers to the airplane vendors. In trying to figure it out, I made some pretty significant discoveries. It starts with that Gulfstream 2 that I mentioned towards the beginning of this video, the one that crash landed in the Yucatan Peninsula. I was trying to learn more about this plane and how exactly it was caught by the Mexican government and how exactly it was purchased by the alleged drug dealers. In my preliminary research, I found this short article. Check out the last line. Quote, "Earlier incorrect reports said that the airplane was used to transport terrorist subjects to the U.S. detention center in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba." End quote. Huh? Prior to this, I hadn't seen a single report about the plane's use in transporting terrorist subjects to Guantanamo Bay. Well, this article said that the reports were false, but where were those reports in the first place? It was once I started looking into this that I discovered a form of government complicity that ran much deeper than deferred prosecution agreements and big fines for big banks. I know that I said that this video is about banks, but unfortunately there's a lot more to this story, and so it's time now to explore the other half of it all, a half that has been left considerably underreported compared to what I've talked about so far. So let's just get into it. About 3 weeks prior to crashing near the Yucatan town of Tixcocob in September 2007, the Gulfstream 2 jet in question was purchased in Boca Raton, Florida by Donna Blue Aircraft Incorporated. Donna Blue is an interesting company. At the time of the purchase, Donna Blue's address was listed as a house in Boca Raton. Its listed phone number was 415-555-5555, an obviously frivolous number, and its website was barely finished and contained a testimonial by a man named John Doe. To say the least, the company, which was owned on paper by two Brazilian men named João Malago and Eduardo Guimarães, appeared a bit fishy. Donna Blue purchased the aircraft on August 30th, 2007. Within a few weeks of purchasing the jet, they already sold it off. This time, its new owners were two men by the name of Greg Smith and Clyde O'Connor. The pair bought the plane from Donna Blue on September 16th, and 2 days later, it was gone via the Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport, headed for Toluca in Mexico. That was the last that was seen or known of the Gulfstream 2 until September 24th, when it crashed back in Mexico, having taken off that day from Rio Negro, Colombia. There's a lot to unpack just in the information we've got right now. When the crash originally took place, no journalists had really looked into the origins of the plane too deeply. Criminal organizations are known for using mysterious or weird shell companies, fake names, and all types of schemes to make their actions seem legitimate. Interrogating any one of the links in this chain would naturally lead to a lot of questions, and that was always sort of understood. What was most unusual about this plane was its tail number, N987SA. The number means nothing on its own, and to most of the reporters who focused on the banking and money laundering side of this whole story, the number would never mean anything more. To the growing underbelly of independent reporters and digital tail spotters in 2007, though, the number rang a bell. You see, a year prior to the crash, and for reasons mostly unrelated, the government of the United Kingdom published a list of flight records that they had sent to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe sometime prior. The Council of Europe wanted these records because they were running their own independent investigation into the complicity of European nations in the CIA's Extraordinary Rendition Program. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, then I encourage you to go to its Wikipedia page, where you might notice that it is a part of a series on kidnapping. Beginning at least during the Clinton administration, the United States government, primarily via the CIA, has been kidnapping people it deems as terrorists and then flying them to third-party black sites in secretive jets not clearly owned by the government. Much has already been written on extraordinary renditions, and it is absolutely not the topic of today. But for the purposes of this video, just know that hidden among the countless planes tallied in the UK government's flight logs, we can find the tail number for that very same Gulfstream II. So a jet that crashed in Mexico with almost 4 tons of cocaine was being used by the CIA just a few years earlier to kidnap enemies of the state. That's kinda crazy. And it was this fact that sent independent reporters into an investigative frenzy. It wouldn't be long before reports started coming out claiming that the plane had made multiple visits to Guantanamo Bay, perhaps the most controversial detention camp that Americans know about. And while I couldn't access any of the flight logs to verify this information myself, reports from reputable sources, such as Bill Conroy from Narco News, lend a strong sense of credibility to these claims. So again, we have more confirmation that the plane was used by the CIA, but it doesn't necessarily say anything about the crash or the people involved in it. But knowing about the plane's past gave reporters a strong reason to interrogate the rest of the plane's history more closely. So let's go back to the start. Remember Donna Blue Aircraft, the plane dealing company that originally bought and sold the Gulfstream just before it crashed? Well, a reporter named Daniel Hopsicker visited one of the previously listed addresses just to find absolutely no sign that a business had ever been there. One of its owners, Joao Malago, was contacted by reporters frequently, and the most he could offer was a bill of sale showing that he sold the plane before it crashed, and an explanation saying that he has no control over what his customers do once his airplane is sold. There were 2 names on the bill of sale that Malago provided, and it's when we look into these guys that things really start to get complicated. Let's start with the easier of the 2, Clyde O'Connor. Back in the day, O'Connor proved hard to get a hold of, but not too hard to track from afar. Various online reports from the time note that he had a history of plane crashes and aviation-related criminal activity. He had what seemed to be a few shell companies of his own, And perhaps most interestingly, after a report came out that O'Connor was in Florida a few days after the Gulfstream crash, it seems that he flew to Canada and was immediately arrested for failing to report the 2 pistols that he flew in with. He's an interesting guy, and there are a handful of reports that spend a decent amount of time looking into him, but I'm gonna be honest, he seems to be, at least to me, a little bit of a red herring. The real person of interest is the other name on the bill of sale, Greg Smith. If O'Connor was hard to track, Greg Smith was nearly impossible. Most reports from the time didn't get far on figuring this guy out. Like O'Connor, Smith's name was attached to a small handful of mysterious aircraft companies, but whenever reporters thought that they'd gotten a hold of him, it would turn out that they'd called the wrong guy. When a local Palm Beach reporter called Gregory J. Smith in Florida, he allegedly responded saying, quote, "I'm not going to divulge anything." When Bill Conroy at Narco News called the same guy sometime later, though, this Smith claimed that the Palm Beach reporter called the wrong guy and that his purported quotes were made up. A document that this Greg Smith provided to Conroy shows that his signature is quite different from the signature of the man that purchased the Gulfstream. At Narco News, though, Bill Conroy had a better way to learn about Smith. Baruch Vega served as an asset for the CIA and other federal agencies for a couple years in the late 90s. His work often involved negotiating with Colombian drug dealers and helping to bait them onto flights into the United States. Eventually, Vega sued the government for failing to pay him for his service, and it was via this back and forth with the government that he eventually became a source for Bill Conroy. Fast forward to 2007, when the news broke about Greg Smith's purchase of the Gulfstream II, Vega informed Conroy that back in the 90s, the FBI had recommended a Greg Smith as a pilot to help the government fly back and forth between Colombia and the United States. Vega cited Aero Group Jets as one of the shell companies Smith was involved with to help facilitate the movement of planes back in the day. When Conroy went back into the records to find documents from Aero Group Jets, he found this signature for a Gregory D. Smith. When compared to the bill of sale signed by a Greg Smith, there are some pretty striking similarities. Of course, I'm no expert in signatures, and neither was Bill Conroy when he wrote on this back in 2007. But Mike Levine, a former DEA agent turned expert witness in court, is quite competent when it comes to comparing signatures, which is why Conroy contacted him back in the day to verify whether the signatures were similar. In Levine's own words, quote, "I would say the samples you sent me are definitely the same handwriting." And now we've got another connection. Not only was the plane once used by the CIA, but one of the 2 final purchasers of the plane also very likely had ties to the federal government. What we've got now is certainly a weird story, but there's still no clear explanation as to why it unfolded the way it did. To really get to the bottom of this, we're gonna have to go back to Donna Blue once again. Who exactly is João Malago? We know, based on every report, that he is a Brazilian national, and at the time of the aircraft purchases, he might not have even been an American citizen. We also know that, besides being the owner of Donna Blue Aircraft, Malago was also involved with a company called Atlantic Alcohol. Now, I couldn't find documents verifying this information myself, as the Florida Corporation's record doesn't seem to have anything for this company prior to 2008, but Bill Conroy did confirm in an interview with Malago that he was in fact the, quote, South American representative for the company at the time. In his own words, Atlantic Alcohol was a biofuel broker specializing in buying ethanol in various parts of the world and reselling it to American and European buyers. That's fair enough, but I will say that this company is extremely suspicious in its own right. In 2013, its status as an official LLC was dissolved due to a failure to submit an annual report, an extremely common occurrence among shell companies. Taking a look at their old brochure or an archived copy of their old website, things just feel a little off. In any case, what matters to us is not Atlantic Alcohol itself, but its owners. In its registration letter from 2008, there are two names listed as managing members of the company, Larry Peters and Neil S. Singer. Let's take a look at Singer first. When Bill Conroy first reached out to Singer in 2008, he was, quote, reluctant to talk to Narco News over the phone, but open to correspondence over email. When Conroy went ahead and emailed asking questions related to the Gulf Stream, though, Singer never got back. Conroy was thus forced to report on the paper trail he could find publicly. Thankfully, among the public records, Singer had his name all over the place. He was involved with an advisory firm called Bison Financial, a company called the Settlement Room, and the Israel Fund, which, according to their now defunct website, was a charity working to improve the lives of people in Israel. I didn't know that their lives were in desperate need of improvement. Regardless of the fact that some of these firms are now defunct or just a little suspicious, they included biographies of Singer that were fairly consistent in what they said. Most notably, they often mentioned his previous work with the government, including consulting work for both NASA and the Department of Defense's Joint Chief of Staff. Bison Financial's bio of him went as far as to say that Singer had a, quote, security clearance at the time, presumably indicating that he was still involved with the government somehow. This is all interesting food for thought, especially the security clearance, but without having further information on him, it's hard to say anything definitive about Singer's involvement in all of this. The other manager at Atlantic Alcohol, Larry Peters, on the other hand, has a much more startling connection to this whole situation. Let's start with Skyway Aircraft. Unlike so many other companies that I came across in my research, Skyway seemed at least a little more legitimate during its 25 years of operation. First of all, most of the other shell companies that I discovered along the way barely lasted more than a few years. Skyway lasting 25 years seems pretty promising on its own. On top of that, though, Skyway's address was listed at an airport hangar, which makes sense, though at some point it seems as though it was listed at the exact same location as Atlantic Alcohol. Singer had told Narco News previously that he had no relation with Skyway, which makes it really kind of weird that they had the same address, but whatever. I will admit that the website for Skyway, which is still up and running at the time of making this video, by the way, is and was a little bit fishy. Peters also seems to have 2 LinkedIn accounts, and when I went to one of them, I found a bunch of testimonials from random accounts that were quite weird themselves. I'll tell you now that whenever you try to investigate a shell company, it will send you down the most insane rabbit hole that literally never ends. But none of that is relevant to this story, so I digress. Peters was the owner of Skyway Aircraft Incorporated, based in St. Petersburg, Florida. Regardless of how fishy and confusing Peters' entire online presence is, what matters most is not the nature of his company, but what it did. And that is that in December 2006, Skyway Aircraft sold a Cessna Conquest II airplane to, quote, Venezuelan buyers. Well, actually, according to FAA records obtained by Bill Conroy, Skyway had actually sold a total of 9 airplanes to Venezuelan buyers between 2003 and 2008. And besides the Cessna Conquest II, there were a few other planes that landed in the headlines as well. 2004, back when the Gulfstream II was still in use as a CIA rendition plane, a Beechcraft King Air 200 landed on a makeshift runway in the remote hills of Nicaragua. As the Nicaraguan press reported days later, when the plane landed, a crew of narco-traffickers were there waiting for it. They had already apprehended the runway's attendant, the sole witness to the scene, and when the plane finally touched down, they moved quickly to unload the 1.1 thousand kilos of cocaine on board before attempting to burn the plane and get out. Unfortunately for them, the plane couldn't catch fire, forcing the men to abandon it along with 7 AK-47 rifles that some of the men had been carrying. Days later, authorities apprehended a truck that was carrying the cocaine, and the entire operation was exposed. That was the story fed to Nicaraguan reporters in the days after this all transpired. But a few details and contradicting facts led many to question the authenticity of it all. First of all, why would they abandon their guns? As a former ICE agent explained to Bill Conroy years later, an AK-47 is a prized possession in the world of drug trafficking. Leaving behind 7 doesn't make much sense. Also, how could they fail to set fire to an airplane when it's literally full of extremely flammable fuel? Most importantly though, the tail numbers and images that were sent to the press were fake. Most outlets claimed that the plane's tail number was either MN167NT or MN168NT, but when the Humboldt Rescue Organization, a Venezuelan nonprofit, went to find the plane itself, this is what they found. This plane clearly says N168D, but wait, if you look up that tail number in the FAA records, you'll see that this number is actually registered to a much larger cargo plane. And on top of that, the owner of that N168D tail number at the time of the crash was a company named Devon Holding and Leasing, Inc. And if we refer all the way back to that European investigation I mentioned way back in the beginning, we will see that Devon Holding is a known CIA shell company. As a matter of fact, the N168D tail number is itself a known CIA rendition plane. So what was the actual tail number of the plane? Well, the Venezuelan nonprofit was actually able to figure it out, and they reported it to be N391SA. And who was the registered owner of that number? None other than Skyway Aircraft, owned by Larry Peters. Well, now we've really got something going. Not only are Larry Peters and Joao Malago both owners of companies that keep selling planes to drug dealers, but both of them have planes that ended up with provable ties to the CIA. When we further consider the fact that their business partner, Neil Singer, has some pretty strong government connections, things especially start to get concerning. I'm not gonna lie, I could probably keep listing planes all day. I have yet to even mention some entire other networks of people and companies with strange connections to cocaine and the CIA. For example, did you know that Larry Peters' former neighbor, Brent Kovar, was the president of a totally different company, also called Skyway, this time called Skyway Communications Holding Corp? That company, whose leaders include Kovar, his parents, and a dude named James Kent, has so many connections to the government that I have yet to fully grasp it myself. And this Skyway, which, by the way, Larry Peters says he has no affiliation with, was once in possession of a DC-9 jet, which 2 years after they purchased and later sold it, was found in Mexico with 5.5 tons of cocaine on it. You might remember me mentioning this plane much earlier, as it's another one of those with verifiable ties to big banks in America. The final owner of that plane, Royal Sons Incorporated, was led by a man named Frederick J. Gaffon, and of course, Gaffon was a shareholder in none other than Skyway Communications. And when Skyway Communications went bankrupt a while later, Royal Sons was noted as a major creditor of Skyway. It feels like every single one of these companies and their owners were tangled up with each other, and they all had way too much experience with cocaine planes and the CIA. But honestly, it's impossible to jump to any conclusions and say that the CIA was necessarily doing something fishy here. That is, unless of course, someone just came out and said it. And that's exactly what happened. Not just once, but multiple times, and by different people over the course of nearly 2 decades. Let's start with Bill Conroy. When he was reporting on all these planes back in the 2000s, he noticed basically every detail I've mentioned so far. And with Narco News being the investigative outlet that it was, Conroy knew that he had to reach out to some people in the government. What he heard at first was quite strange. According to an anonymous source in the DEA, all of these planes were tied to a clandestine operation spearheaded by ICE, the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Agency. The source claimed that ICE was, quote, running amok, and that it was running this program without the support of other agencies. Although the exact goals of the operation were not yet clear, it was clear that it probably wasn't just ICE carrying all this out. As Conroy asserted in his first article on this issue and has repeated ad nauseum to this day, when you set foot outside the United States, the CIA is God. No American agency can conduct any operations without the knowledge and involvement of the CIA. So to think that ICE could be doing this unilaterally and without any support is a little far-fetched. The fact that many of these planes have direct ties to the CIA adds to this reality, and as Conroy wrote in his first article on this issue, the CIA is known to use other agencies as fronts to carry out its operations. Between shell companies and fake tail numbers and front agencies, the CIA seems to do a lot to make its involvement as unknown as possible. But regardless, according to Conroy's informants, the operation was dubbed Mayan Express. The ultimate goals were not entirely clear, but one could speculate based on past CIA activities. The Bush administration was dotted with veterans from the Iran-Contra affair, which, if you're unfamiliar, was when the Reagan administration used the proceeds of drug dealing to fund Nicaraguan rebels. And outside of the Iran-Contra situation, other members of the Bush administration were no strangers when it came to meddling in Latin America. But Conroy and other journalists didn't have to speculate for too long, because 5 years after the Gulf Stream crashed, the arrest of one man would expose almost the entirety of this operation. Remember Joao Malago? Remember how I mentioned that he wasn't an American citizen? Well, it turns out non-citizens aren't allowed to own airplanes registered in the United States, and it turns out Malago barely had any legal protections to stay in the United States in the first place. When the Gulf Stream crashed in 2007, Malago was actually still living in Brazil, but when the Mexican government investigated the crash and found American government transponders on the plane, suspicions grew that it was part of a covert federal operation. With the cover blown, ICE told Malago to come to the United States for his own safety, and the operation came to a screeching halt. When the conflict made its way into the federal government and fights were put up to end the program, it seems that Malago was caught in the crossfires, and he was hit with the charges of money laundering and drug trafficking. With his lack of protections as a citizen, the threat of deportation forced him to blow his own cover. In court, Malago and his lawyer laid down the whole story. As it turns out, the operation wasn't called Mayan Express. It was called Mayan Jaguar, named after the big cats that roamed the very land where the government was moving drugs. As far as Malago was aware, the goal of Mayan Jaguar was to catch drug dealers. On most of the planes he sold, ICE would plant a transponder through which they could track its movements as it picked up drugs and made its way back into the United States. The goal would theoretically be to apprehend the traffickers at some point along the supply chain, preventing the trafficking and dismantling cartel operations. This never happened. As it turns out, this operation led to no seizures nor prosecutions in the United States. What's worse, most of the planes that ended up captured in Mexico didn't even have transponders on them. This apparent operational failure contributed massively to the internal frustrations within the US government that eventually shut the program down. And on top of that, it's what led prosecutors to suspect that Malago was complicit in its operational failure. Malago's case made massive revelations, offering us clear names of some of those involved. Larry Peters was among them, by the way. The case also helped in mapping out many of the other planes that we didn't even know about. Just as his case was moving along in court, though, it was suddenly dismissed. This dismissal fell right in line with a prediction that a DEA agent had made to Bill Conroy back in the day. As is apparently typical, whenever a court case gets too close to revealing the full truth, it is almost always dismissed. The dismissal of Malago's case leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Just last year, a Rolling Stone article was released detailing the history of Mayan Jaguar, Malago's involvement, and the planes that trafficked the drugs. But the article failed to ask why the CIA kept making random appearances at every turn. If Bill Conroy's sources are to be believed, then this was no ICE operation at all. It was CIA through and through. But if that's the case, then we must seriously reevaluate whether or not the goal was ever to stop the drug dealers in the first place. The CIA's job is to gather intelligence and carry out American foreign policy. When they sold drugs to armed rebels in the 80s, there was no claim that the drug dealers would eventually be captured. The point was to arm the rebels by any means necessary. When we consider the fact that America had multiple vested foreign policy interests in Latin America in the mid-2000s, then we really need to ask if Mayan Jaguar was maybe meant to help carry out those goals. Mayan Jaguar began officially in 2004. In 2006, we saw the commencement of the war on drugs in Mexico, aided by the American-sponsored Mérida Initiative. I touched on this a little bit during my last video, but the Mérida Initiative, under the guise of fighting drugs, helped shape Mexico into the 21st century neoliberal entity that it is today. The escalating violence of the drug war, which was often facilitated and supported by the American and Mexican governments, became an excuse to tear down and restructure Mexico in the image of American financial interests, all while drugs were tearing through both countries, and clearly some of those drugs were moved by the CIA. Transnational corporations poured in and built business empires on the dead bodies of the drug war's victims. Whether or not the CIA trafficked drugs for this express purpose, it seems abundantly clear that they kinda sorta helped in that whole process. Outside of Mexico, though, there was a much bigger foreign policy threat in the region during the 2000s, and the details and timeline of Mayan Jaguar align closely with the Bush administration's efforts to undermine this threat. I'm talking, of course, about none other than Hugo Chávez's Venezuela. It's unbelievably ironic to talk about Venezuela in 2025, given the fact that 20 years after this all happened, the American government is still sending in the CIA to try and undermine their government and get a hold of the country's massive oil reserves. But well before there was Trump and his habit of blowing up random boats and gearing up for war, there was the Bush administration and their constant efforts to destabilize Venezuela. I'd like to refer to one last document to make my argument here. In 2007, the United States brought charges against a man named Pedro José Benavides Natera for his involvement in laundering money for Venezuelan drug dealers. Benavides Natera would apparently take laundered drug money to purchase airplanes in the United States. These airplanes, though the affidavit never mentions it, of course, were all eventually tied back to Mayan Jaguar. One of the planes was even purchased from Larry Peters and Skyway Aircraft, but that is besides the point. This case was brought well before Mayan Jaguar was known, and in it was alleged that Benavides Natera would buy these planes for the use of Venezuela-based drug trafficking organizations. You know, if we didn't know any better, it wouldn't sound that outlandish that Venezuelan drug dealers were buying these planes and using them to sell drugs, I guess. But we know that these planes weren't being used for that purpose. They were being used by the CIA. So if the CIA was using planes to transport drugs and they were doing it under the guise of being Venezuelan criminals, so much so that even the FBI prosecutes them as such, then there might be a good chance that the entire purpose of this operation, or at least one of its goals, was to collect intelligence in Venezuela. As we know, there was a failed coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002, and as Narco News founder Al Giordano reported at the time, the CIA had its fingers all over that whole situation as well. One of Bill Conroy's sources, a former customs agent named Mark Conrad, actually speculated so much about Mayan Jaguar back in 2008. As he put it, quote, "My guess, and that's all that this is that this has something to do with operations in Venezuela, either to finance ops or to divert attention from agency ops in Venezuela to destabilize Chavez. It is not in the U.S. interest for Chavez to create another Cuba on some of the largest oil field reserves in the world." Quite frankly, until more details on Mayan Jaguar come out, if they ever do, we won't know for certain why this operation was being carried out. What we do know, though, is that far from just some regular drug dealers, the buyers and users of these planes were tangled up in bed with the American government in too many ways to count. The symbiosis is so pervasive that the line between drug dealer and federal agent begins to blur beyond distinction, and we are forced to start wondering whether the entire supply chain has been facilitated by our own federal government. Oh yeah, and one more thing, Pedro Jose Benavides Natera, the drug money launderer who helped buy those planes for the Venezuelans, guess who wired the money into his account to afford those airplanes? Well, if we refer to the FBI affidavit, we will see that it was none other than, oh yeah, Casa de Cambio Puebla, among others. And which banks were the ones who held accounts with these Casas de Cambio, allowing the entire operation to unfold? Oh yeah, Wachovia and HSBC. I wonder if any of the higher-ups at any of these banks knew that they were laundering money for a CIA operation when they were doing all this back in the 2000s. And I wonder if they knew about this when they shut down whistleblowers like Martin Woods. We genuinely don't know, and it's very possible that they didn't know. But hey, at least we know now. I also wonder, though, if people in the Obama administration knew about all this when they decided not to prosecute these banks. They have much less plausible deniability than the bankers. I mean, let's not forget that Obama's CIA and foreign policy did not differ that much from that of his predecessor, especially when it came to Latin America. And, you know, Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, he's not exactly a stranger when it comes to accidentally lending a helping hand to drug dealers. When Obama failed to hold all those fat cats responsible back in the day, we can't help but wonder whether or not he had a Mayan Jaguar in the back of his mind the whole time. And given the fact that still to this day, the CIA is carrying out covert operations in Venezuela under the direction of Donald Trump, among the many other things we are doing in Venezuela right now, we can only wonder what type of shenanigans they've been getting up to in the 18 years since Mayan Jaguar shut down. As you might be able to tell, this video was quite research intensive on my part, but truth be told, none of the stuff that I talked about today was particularly groundbreaking or unknown. On the money laundering side, much of this has been covered to death in American media, and of course, Martin Woods' story has been well known for almost 2 decades. Regarding Mayan Jaguar and the cocaine planes, I hope I made it clear that Bill Conroy was the guy that really helped put this all together back in the day. Nearly all of the important details can be attributed to the work he did in the 2000s and 2010s, and when the Rolling Stone article that I mentioned came out last year, he had some critical words to explain where it fell short. I reached out to Conroy in the making of this video to help with some research questions, so I'd like to thank him and definitely encourage anyone watching to tune into all the work he's done across his career. There are still so many unanswered questions about Mayan Jaguar and the 2 decades since the project ended. A lot of the people involved are still out there to this day, and though I tried reaching out to a few, there are so many more angles that I didn't chase after in the making of this video specifically. In the future, I might take up the task of revisiting some of the names I brought up today and examining where they are now, or maybe who has followed in their footsteps. We know that the CIA is out there doing stuff, so it's only a matter of time before it becomes public knowledge. I also want to stress that we shouldn't forget what I talked about in the first half of this video. Yes, the CIA's involvement in all of this is insane, but whether or not the CIA is involved, Martin Woods made it unbelievably clear how ready banks are to launder money for whoever it may be. We don't know who, if anyone at these banks, knew exactly what the laundered money was being used for, but we know that they were eager to launder the money regardless. That is a story in and of itself, and we shouldn't lose sight of it in the midst of all these deeper connections. Like in my last video, my ultimate goal in this video was simply to undermine the classic narratives that surround drug war discourse. Drug dealers use banks to launder money. Sure, but as I hopefully demonstrated here, the story goes so much deeper than that, and the names implicated are so far-reaching. When drug dealers launder money, they often do it at the behest of much more powerful actors trying to carry out much wider political goals. In this case, it's the CIA gathering intelligence and undermining the stability of foreign nations. And no matter who is actually doing the crimes, once the money moves through the system, the banks get away with facilitating it. By the time it's all said and done, our original conception of crime and complicity has necessarily and completely fallen apart. I hope you managed to learn a thing or two from this video, but on top of that, I hope you enjoyed going through the rabbit hole of CIA covert activities. I touched on a lot in this video, never really settling down on one scene for too long, but in doing so, I hope I demonstrated how far you can get simply by asking questions. A lot went into this video, but the research was super fascinating, and I will definitely be revisiting this and other topics in the future. So with all that said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.